Hey guys, Derek here from Back to Reality. So last spring, in the interest of continuing our experimentation with the Ruth Stout Method, we decided to plant a small crop of potatoes in a no-dig, hay-only garden. But as a number of you have pointed out in the comments, we still owe you an update on our results. And as you can tell by all the snow behind me, it's long overdue. So for a detailed account of how we actually plant the potatoes, I've put a link to that video in the description below this one. But as usual, here's a really quick recap. First of all, the Ruth Stout Method is a form of sheet mulching where instead of amending and tilling your soil, you build new soil over time by simply spreading out a thick layer of organic matter and then letting nature do the rest. In Ruth's case, she primarily recommended using old spoiled hay, and so that's been our focus as well. Over time, the mulch smothers out the grass and weeds, prevents evaporation, insulates the ground in winter, cools it in summer, and adds nutrients as it begins to break down. The end result is an extremely fertile garden that requires no digging, no tilling, no fertilizing, no watering, and very little weeding. Or at least, that's the claim. So to test it for ourselves, we began the previous fall by cutting the grass, measuring and marking the designated area, laying out a bunch of old spoiled hay, and then just letting it sit there all winter. In the spring, we planted 4 varieties of seed potatoes by simply pushing the hay aside, dropping them in whole, and then covering them up with an additional layer of hay. Now remember, we never dug, tilled, or amended this plot. We never removed the sod layer, and we didn't bury the potatoes in soil. We literally just covered them with a layer of hay. A couple weeks later, we pulled some of the hay aside to see how they were progressing, and we found that tiny hair-like roots were already beginning to form. So far so good. Eventually, the stems and leaves reached the surface and began breaking through the mulch. Now, the more traditional methods require that you start hilling the potatoes with soil once they get to be about 8 to 12 inches tall. That forces the plant to grow taller and encourages the development of even more tubers underneath. But that also requires a lot of digging, and as I mentioned, this is a no-dig garden. So instead, we simply covered the foliage in additional layers of mulch. Ruth said that hay was best, but that pretty much any organic matter would do in a pinch. So after we ran out of hay, we began using old dried up leaves, and from what we can tell, they seem to work just as well. By midsummer, we were pleased to see that a bunch of pretty little flowers were beginning to bloom, but we never expected what came next. Potato fruit. Now, we've devoted an entire video to those little guys, so if you haven't seen it, be sure to check that out in the description as well. However, while potato fruit are a natural part of the plant's life cycle, they typically only form under very specific weather conditions, and some say that they're often an indicator of a smaller overall yield. So we delighted in their appearance from a curiosity perspective, but we're also a little bit worried about what they might mean for our eventual harvest. But speaking of which, it was also around that time that we first began reaching under the mulch to see if any actual potatoes were beginning to form. And much to our excitement, they had. Our first check resulted in 2 small potatoes, one red and one white. But over the remainder of the season, we continued to harvest a few handfuls every week or so for dinner, and even shared some with family. Now, if you've never eaten a freshly picked potato before, we highly recommend it. They were crisp and delicious, their skin was soft and tender, and they only required a quick rinse before cooking. We tried them raw, baked, boiled, mashed, and roasted, and our only complaint was that we hadn't planted more of them. But enough about our dinners. Let's fast forward to the final harvest. Like us, many people harvest young potatoes throughout the growing season, but the final harvest typically happens once the foliage begins to die off and wither. And from what we gather, the process is typically rather tedious because it involves removing tons of earth while also being careful not to damage the delicate tubers within. But as you can see, in our case, the harvest was incredibly easy. All we had to do was pull back the mulch and pick the fresh potatoes off the ground. Much of the mulch had already fully composted, so some of the potatoes took a little bit more searching, but even still, we had the bulk of them exposed in less than 10 minutes. After that, we took our time pulling a few of the weeds from the edges, and then we were done. Once we had all the potatoes removed, we took the opportunity to inspect the soil underneath. And my goodness, what a difference. Once again, this was a lawn less than a year ago. And all we did was mow it and then keep it covered with hay and leaves, and yet there were hardly any remaining signs of the grass or its roots. All we could find were bits of compost and a healthy number of worms. After that, all that was left was to rake the mulch back onto the soil and then cover it with another thick layer of spoiled hay. And with that, it was fully prepped for next season. So overall, this experiment was definitely a success. We grew and harvested a good amount of potatoes without ever having to water or weed them. This definitely qualified as no dig and very little work. However, I think we could easily achieve an even better harvest next year by applying a few simple lessons learned from this first attempt. For starters, most people cut their seed potatoes into chunks before planting them, because each one of the eyes is capable of sprouting a whole new plant. So cutting them up allows you to cover a larger surface area with a greater number of potential plants, and most people claim that that will provide a much higher yield. And it seems pretty logical. But Ruth was an advocate of only doing the work that was absolutely necessary, and she didn't think this extra trouble was worth it. But I think we'll cut them up next year to see the difference and make that determination for ourselves. Another thing I learned is that we probably should have hilled our potatoes much more often. As I mentioned, burying the foliage forces the plant to grow taller and encourages the growth of even more of the tubers. But we only hilled our crop a couple of times throughout the summer, and in hindsight, considering how simple and easy it was, we could have done that much more often. We'll be a lot more on top of that next year. And finally, we now realize that we simply need to plant a much larger crop in the future. Potatoes make up a pretty large part of our diet, and so if we ever hope to become food self-sustainable, the amount we harvested this year just isn't going to cut it. So, as you can see in the background, we've already begun the process of expanding our growing area. But we'll get to that in another video. So for now, thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.